President Trump was very clear that the United States wanted to achieve a ceasefire at this meeting in Alaska, said French President Emmanuel Macron following a video call earlier on Wednesday. U.S. President Donald Trump also said Ukraine must be involved in the talks about territory in any ceasefire deal with Russia. How are today's talks between Europe, Ukraine, and the U.S. going to change the trajectory of the Friday meeting between Trump and Putin? Mark Toth, U.S. national security and foreign policy analyst, joins me now to discuss what changed after these officials spoke. Good evening, and thank you for joining.
Good evening. Thank you for having me back on TVP World.
Always a pleasure. So recently, President Trump said that he is somewhat annoyed by President Zelensky's behavior. Do you think that this changed after the talk they had today?
Hopefully so, because look, there are certain constraints that Zelensky has in terms of the Rada and what is rightly, the Ukrainian parliament, what is rightly their domain, and any kind of territorial concessions would have to come from them. It's not something that Zelensky himself can do by edict. And hopefully he conveyed that to Trump, that he doesn't have this power that Trump seems to think he does, that he can just divvy up in some kind of land swap with Putin and come to some type of deal in terms of a long-term solution or peace deal. What really needs to be the focus here is the ceasefire, and hopefully that's what Zelensky was able to convey along with NATO partners in discussion with Trump in those conversations that happened earlier.
During today's call, we know that Mr. Zelensky said what security guarantees might look like and from which countries was not the subject of today's talks, but this will have to follow as soon as the path to peace has been opened. However, we did hear from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, we did hear from German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and they did mention the security guarantees. What do you think those security guarantees could possibly look like?
Right. It's important, I think, for them to be as robust as possible. You have to have U.S. participation in it. And the Kiev Post, and full disclosure, a paper that I also write for, is reporting that in that discussions with Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany, that he had with Zelensky earlier, that was one of the parameters that Trump had expressed willingness allegedly in this call that there would be U.S. participation. So whether that's just logistical support, intelligence support, satellite overview, et cetera, that's a critical component. I think to get to the heart of your question, what also needs to happen is you do need NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine in a post-war environment. Now, maybe they don't have to be wearing the NATO badge because that might be an issue with the Russians, but there certainly needs to be Polish troops there, British troops there, French troops there to enforce this so that Putin at some point in the future doesn't decide, as many of us fear, and frankly predict that he would, simply start this war up again. So that has to happen. And then air defenses. In terms of the security guarantees, I think you have to have an active defense that's pushed forward to make sure that there's not skirmishes that happen in some kind of post-war or post-ceasefire environment. Those are ideals, but we're not close yet in terms of getting there.
Mm-hmm. Which takes me to my next question. How long do you think it would actually take all of us to get to a point where there is a ceasefire agreement? Because we know that in terms of past conflicts that we've seen, there's been a certain timeline that has to be fulfilled before something is actually set in stone and put on paper. How long for this conflict do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to get into the prediction game. It's a fair question. Many of us are wondering. I think it's probably better, though, to step back and look at how far apart the two sides are. At this point, the Russian Foreign Ministry, yet again today, is still setting out maximalist conditions. They're claiming, for instance, that they're not willing to withdraw from Kherson, from Zaporizhia, or from any part of the Donetsk, claiming that these referendums they had and the incorporation into Russia itself means that they're constitutionally now protected and enshrined in Russia and that they can't give that up. So that's maximalist. They're not willing to yield anything. They still want it all. And if viewers will remember, it's not that they just annexed those territories that they control, those portions of those territories that they control. They annexed all of them, including parts that Ukraine still controls. And obviously, Ukraine is not going to give up land that's sovereign and be still under the control of their military. So I really think the two sides are far off. If you look at the statement that was put out by Friedrich Merz and by Volodymyr Zelensky today, it made it clear as well that, look, this first step needs to be ceasefire focused, and with the conditions being that Ukraine still has to have the right to join NATO, that it's not going to withdraw from the Donbas. That's something else that Putin wants very much. But if Ukraine were to do that, it would be in effect military suicide, because they'd be giving up their key fortress belt that's really stopped Putin from making sweeping gains. So I don't think we're anywhere close to kind of put a bow on your question, just because the two sides at this point are still talking maximalists. Never say never. There could be breakthroughs at this point. But at this point, if we listen to the words that each side is saying, they're still very, very far apart.
Mm-hmm. It is widely understood in the West that the security of Ukraine also equals security of Europe. And as we've heard from Prime Minister Donald Tusk, Russia may use ceasefire to build up and strike again. Also, we've heard from Mr. Zelensky, who said Putin is bluffing. He's trying to put pressure before the meeting in Alaska. How do we stop that from happening? What has to happen during that meeting? What borders, what boundaries have to be laid down for that not to take place?
Right. What Frederick Merz did today by meeting with Zelensky and laying these out, the statements by your own Prime Minister Donald Tusk saying the same thing, I think is an important first step. Because what you can't have is you can't have a U.S. president saying, look, Europe needs to up its defense spending, get it to 5% GDP, and claim that the reason you need to do that is because of a future Russian threat, right? And Trump has done all of that. He's acknowledged that Russia represents a threat, not just to Eastern Europe, but to all of Europe. But you can't do that and then turn around and then in Alaska, come Friday, have Trump negotiate on behalf of all of Europe. You need your own red lines. And those red lines have to be a complete understanding that Putin cannot be allowed to win in Ukraine. Any kind of peace settlement that comes about, and initially a ceasefire, cannot make concessions that would put Eastern Europe, particularly Poland, the Suwalki Gap, the Baltic states, and now Finland, that it's now part of NATO, any of those countries at risk. And certainly, out there, kind of as a tangent, Moldova as well. So, those are all things that Europe has to say, look, the keystone to protecting all of that and stopping this war from going further west and reaching into Poland, into Berlin, into Brussels, et cetera, it all depends on making sure that Ukraine doesn't lose. So in my mind, before Friday, it's got to be very clear from our NATO allies that, look, these are red lines for us. We're not going to allow some kind of grand land swap that results in an advantageous military position for Putin at the expense of Europe's long-term security. And let me be very clear here, just quickly, it's Europe's security would be very much at risk if that comes about. Ukraine needs to win. Ukraine needs to remain independent. Ukraine needs to be part of NATO to protect Eastern Europe in the long run.
Our time is coming to an end, but very shortly, last but not least, Trilateral Summit. We've heard from President Macron. We know that there is that plan. When would it happen? What do you think?
Yeah, it should have happened as the first step. I think Trump made a huge mistake here backing off of it. He's trying to hide behind that it was Putin that extended the invitation to meet. And so hopefully, there's discussion yet today that Trump is pushing for it. I think Trump and Zelensky would be perfectly happy to do it. I suspect that if it's agreed to, you'll see that Putin, one way or the other, backs out of it. But time will tell. But it should happen as fast as possible, because Ukraine should be there at the table. And frankly, real quickly here, so should the rest of Europe. This is everyone's long-term fight here. And you all need seats at the table. Just cannot be Trump doing it.
Thank you so much. Mark Toth, U.S. National Security and Foreign Policy Analyst, was my guest.
Right.
Thank you. And so this would be all for now, but please do tune in tomorrow for another edition of World News Tonight at 8 p.m. CET. I'm Claudia Czerwińska, and we're going to see you there.